The Earl called her plain, before London called her perfect. A single careless insult began the most scandalous transformation in London's history. The chandeliers of Lady Beaumont's spring ball glittered like 1,000 stars trapped beneath glass, and every heart in the room beat in time with the waltz. The year was 1816, the height of the season, and London was drunk on beauty. Perfume, silk, and whispers filled the air, as debutantes in pastel gowns fluttered their fans like butterflies caught in the same gilded cage. Amid this shimmering world stood Miss Clara Hensley, a quiet girl in a gown too modest for the occasion, and eyes far too kind for society's cruelty. She had come because her mother insisted it was her chance, her only chance, to be noticed by a man of good fortune. But as she stood near the grand staircase, clutching her fan, she knew no one was looking at her. Not really. Not until he did. Lord Nathaniel Ashford, the Earl of Evermere, was the sort of man who could silence a room simply by entering it. Tall, dark-haired, and impeccably dressed, he wore charm like armor. His reputation was both dazzling and dangerous, admired by men, adored by women, and untouched by sincerity. When his gaze brushed over Clara, her heart stuttered. He looked at her, truly looked, and for a moment she thought perhaps fate had chosen her after all. But fate, she was about to learn, was not kind. From across the ballroom she overheard his voice, low, amused, and cruelly casual. One of his companions, Lord Pembroke, gestured toward her with his glass of champagne. "Pretty enough, don't you think?" he said, smirking. Nathaniel's reply was soft, but it sliced like a blade. "She has a pleasant enough mind, I suppose, but beauty?" He gave a careless shrug. "She has none to speak of." The laughter that followed was light, meaningless, to them. To her it was thunder. The music carried on, violins swirling through the air, but the melody blurred into silence as her vision stung with tears she refused to shed. She turned away before anyone could see her face, forcing her breath to steady as the walls of the ballroom seemed to close in around her. In that instant, something inside Clara Hensley broke, but something else began to bloom. She left the ball quietly, her slippers brushing the marble floor like whispers of dignity. Outside, the air was sharp and cold, carrying the distant laughter of the very people who had dismissed her. She climbed into her carriage alone, her hands trembling in her lap, and for the first time she did not cry. When she arrived home, she stood before her mirror, studying the reflection that society had deemed plain. The girl who looked back was not ugly, merely unseen. Her eyes were the color of tea before dawn, her lips soft but unsmiling, her hair a chestnut that refused to catch the light. Yet beneath it all was something Nathaniel Ashford had failed to recognize: strength. "You think I am nothing?" she whispered to her reflection. "Then I will become something you cannot ignore." Her voice was quiet but fierce, a vow born not of vanity but of defiance. Over the next weeks, London continued to chatter. They forgot her name as easily as they had mocked it. But Clara remembered. She remembered every word, every laugh, every moment of humiliation, and though her heart still ached, it no longer hurt like a wound. It burned like a promise. When the invitation arrived from her godmother, the Marchioness of Waverley, Clara took it as a sign. The Marchioness was a legend, elegant, powerful, feared, and she had written in her letter, "Come to me, child. The world may have overlooked you, but I will not." Clara folded the letter with trembling fingers. She packed her gowns, her pride, and the last remnants of her innocence, and left her small, forgotten corner of London. She did not know that the journey ahead would change her name, her destiny, and even the man who had once called her plain. Because beauty, she would learn, is not something one is given. It is something one becomes. As the carriage rolled through the night toward Waverley House, Clara gazed out at the moonlit countryside, her reflection faint in the glass. "One day," she whispered, "he will look at me and wish he had never spoken." And somewhere in Mayfair, the Earl of Evermere laughed at another ball, unaware that the girl he'd wounded would soon become the very legend London could not stop speaking of. Not out of pity, not out of scandal, but out of awe. The carriage stopped before Waverley House just as dawn brushed pale gold over the rooftops of London. The great townhouse stood like a memory carved in stone, tall, graceful, and quietly powerful, much like the woman who ruled it. When Clara Hensley stepped out, clutching her small valise and her fragile dignity, she could hardly believe she'd been invited here at all. The Marchioness of Waverley was a woman of legend, elegant, sharp-tongued, and rumoured to have taught half the ton how to hold a teacup, and the other half how to ruin a man's reputation with a single glance. "Miss Hensley," said the butler as the doors swung open, "her ladyship has been expecting you." The Marchioness was seated in a high-backed chair by the fire, dressed in deep emerald silk, her silver hair coiled like a crown. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, swept over Clara from bonnet to boots. For a long moment she said nothing, and then, to Clara's surprise, she smiled. "You have potential," she said. "Not in beauty, perhaps, though that can be crafted, but in presence. Sit down, child, we have work to do." From that moment, Clara's transformation began. Not the false kind that relied on jewels and powders, but the slow, painstaking kind that reshapes the soul. The Marchioness's methods were unorthodox and merciless. Each morning began with posture and poise lessons, where Clara balanced a book atop her head while answering questions about politics. "A woman must carry her thoughts as gracefully as her gown," the Marchioness would say. Afternoons were spent learning conversation, not the shallow chatter of gossip, but wit and intelligence that turned heads for all the right reasons. "If they speak of your beauty, they will forget you tomorrow," her godmother warned. "But if they quote your words, they will never stop listening." Evenings were for music, reading aloud, and, when Clara was too tired to stand, discussions about the world beyond society. "Charm fades," the Marchioness said one night, pouring tea with precise movements, "but character endures. That, my dear, is your true inheritance." Clara listened, absorbed, and slowly began to change. Her movements grew measured, her speech more confident, her laughter freer. The servants began to notice first the way she stood taller, the way her eyes shone not from tears, but from curiosity. Her reflection changed too, not in shape, but in spirit. Her hair, once simply pinned, now framed her face with soft curls. Her gowns, chosen with care by the Marchioness's seamstress, no longer tried to dazzle. They fit her, as if finally admitting she belonged in them. But the greatest change came from within. For the first time, Clara looked into the mirror and did not search for flaws. She found herself instead. One evening, as spring faded into summer, the Marchioness brought out an old velvet box. Inside lay a necklace, delicate pearls strung on gold. "These were mine," she said, fastening them around Clara's neck. "They once belonged to a woman everyone overlooked, until she stopped asking for approval." Clara touched the pearls, speechless. "You are ready?" the Marchioness continued. "The new season begins in a fortnight. You will attend the Duke of Ainsworth's masquerade. Let them see what ignorance made them blind to." Clara hesitated. And if they do not? Then you will still see yourself, her godmother said simply, and that will be victory enough. The night of the masquerade arrived like a scene from a dream. The ballroom at Ainsworth Hall shimmered under candlelight, gold chandeliers dripping with crystals, musicians tuning their violins as London's elite stepped through marble arches in a whirl of colour. When Miss Clara Hensley entered, the air seemed to shift. Her gown was pale lavender, almost silver under the glow, embroidered with tiny pearls that caught the light like stars. Her mask, delicate and lace-trimmed, covered only her eyes, which gleamed with quiet confidence. She walked, not as someone seeking attention, but as someone perfectly at ease with who she had become. Heads turned, whispers followed. Even the women who had once dismissed her found themselves pausing mid-sentence. There was something magnetic in her calm. The Marchioness, watching from across the room, smiled behind her fan. "Ah," she murmured, "they see it now." And then, as fate would have it, Lord Nathaniel Ashford, the Earl of Evermere himself, entered the ballroom. He had not changed, still impossibly handsome, still commanding every eye in the room. But tonight his gaze caught on the mysterious woman in lavender. He didn't know her name, not yet, but something about her presence pulled him across the floor. When he asked her for a dance, she inclined her head with polite amusement. "Do I know you, my lady?" he asked, offering his hand. Clara smiled faintly behind her mask. "Perhaps once," she said, voice soft but sure. "Though I suspect you were not looking very closely." He frowned, intrigued. The orchestra began to play. As they waltzed, her every step was effortless, confident, graceful, untouchable. For the first time in years, the Earl of Evermere found himself at a loss for words, and when the final note faded, she curtsied, thanked him sweetly, and disappeared into the crowd, leaving him standing alone, heart pounding, utterly undone. Later, as the carriages lined up outside and the guests drifted into the night, Nathaniel turned to Lord Pembroke, the same man who had once mocked Clara beside him. "Did you see her?" he asked quietly. "The woman in lavender?" Pembroke grinned. "Every man saw her, Evermere. I imagine half of London is in love with her already." Nathaniel's eyes darkened. "Then I fear I am already too late." He didn't yet know her name. He didn't yet realize the cruel symmetry of his fate. But the woman he had once called plain had become the one woman he could not forget. And somewhere, hidden behind her mask and her new grace, Clara Hensley smiled to herself, her vow fulfilled, not through revenge, but through rebirth. Because beauty had never been the goal, power was. The morning after the masquerade, Lord Nathaniel Ashford found himself pacing his study like a restless man haunted by a ghost. He could not sleep, nor could he forget the woman in lavender, her poise, her voice, the quiet command in her every movement. He had danced with countless ladies before, women who chased his title, his wealth, or the illusion of charm he wore like a glove. But she had been different. She had neither flattered nor fawned. She had seen him, and walked away without care. He told himself it was curiosity that unsettled him. Yet, as the day wore on, curiosity began to feel uncomfortably like longing. That evening, at the Duke of Ainsworth's garden dinner, Nathaniel returned, if only to ask questions. The ballroom chatter buzzed around him, but his attention was fixed on the entrance. He waited, and then, as if conjured by the very ache in his chest, she appeared again. Clara Hensley, unveiled at last. She wore a gown of pale blue silk that shimmered like moonlight, her hair swept into elegant curls, her expression serene. For a brief moment, he thought he must be mistaken. Surely this could not be her, the shy, unremarkable girl from Lady Beaumont's ball, the one he had dismissed with careless cruelty. But when she turned, he caught the glint of recognition in her eyes. Cool, composed, and unflinching. The realization struck him harder than any scandal ever could. He had once called her plain. Now she was the most breathtaking woman in the room. Not because of beauty alone, but because she carried herself as if she owed the world nothing. The orchestra began to play a soft waltz. Nathaniel crossed the floor, ignoring the murmurs that followed him. London watched as the once untouchable Earl of Evermere stopped before the woman he had once humiliated. "Miss Hensley," he said, bowing low, "would you grant me the honor of this dance?" Her voice was calm, melodic, and faintly amused. "I was under the impression, my lord, that you preferred not to dance with women who lack beauty." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Nathaniel froze, shame flashing across his face, but then, to his own surprise, he smiled softly. "Then perhaps you will allow me to correct that very grave mistake." Clara studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Very well, my lord. One dance." The waltz began. As they moved together, the ballroom seemed to fade away. The chandeliers, the whispers, the endless eyes. Nathaniel could hear only the rhythm of her breath and the steady beat of his own heart. "You've changed," he said quietly. "No," she replied. "I simply stopped pretending to be less than I am." He looked down at her, eyes full of something that was neither arrogance nor pity, but awe. "You make it sound so simple." "It wasn't," she said softly, her gaze distant. "But it was necessary." He hesitated, then asked, "Do you despise me?" Clara smiled faintly. "No, I don't waste hatred on men who once mattered so little." The words should have wounded him. Instead, they humbled him. For the first time in his life, Nathaniel understood what it felt like to be dismissed, not as punishment, but as justice. When the waltz ended, she curtsied gracefully and turned to leave, but he caught her hand, just for a moment, his voice low. "Miss Hensley, I owe you an apology." She met his gaze, steady and unreadable. "Then I hope, my lord, you'll find a way to make it worth hearing." With that, she walked away, and the Earl of Evermere, who had once commanded every conversation in London, was left speechless. In the weeks that followed, London society could speak of nothing else. "The Earl is smitten," whispered Lady Pembroke over tea. "He follows her like a shadow," said another. "And she ignores him like a ghost," added a third. Indeed, wherever Clara went, Nathaniel was not far behind. He sent flowers. She returned them. He wrote letters. She sent them back, unopened. When he attended gatherings, she seemed always to be on the opposite side of the room, smiling easily at other men, perfectly indifferent to his presence. But though she kept her distance, she felt the heat of his gaze like sunlight. She could not quite escape. At first, she had told herself that she wanted revenge, that seeing him suffer the way she once had would be enough. But revenge, she discovered, was hollow. Each time she saw the regret in his eyes, the sincerity in his voice, something inside her softened against her will. One evening, she found herself alone in the library at Waverley House, lost in thought. The Marchioness entered quietly, observing her. "You are troubled, my dear," she said. "Is it him?" Clara sighed, closing the book in her lap. "He was cruel once, but I think he's not that man any more." The Marchioness smiled knowingly. Men rarely are when they finally meet a woman who forces them to see themselves. Clara hesitated. "And what should I do?" Her godmother's eyes twinkled. "Nothing at all. If his love is real, he will find you again. And if it is not, he will find someone easier to adore." 2 nights later, at the Duchess of Briarwood's ball, fate, mischievous as ever, placed them together again. Nathaniel approached her, but this time there was no arrogance in his step. He bowed deeply. "Miss Hensley, I cannot undo what I said, but I can spend the rest of my life proving that I was wrong." Clara tilted her head, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "Then you have quite a task ahead, my lord. The season is long, and London is watching." He grinned, softly but sincerely. "Then let them." As the orchestra began another waltz, he extended his hand once more. For the briefest moment, she hesitated. Then, with grace born of both pride and forgiveness, she placed her gloved hand in his. The crowd whispered as they moved across the floor again, but this time it wasn't mockery that filled the air. It was admiration, and in that golden moment beneath the chandeliers, London's most arrogant Earl and its most underestimated lady began a new dance. One not of pride and punishment, but of awakening. London's season bloomed in full splendor that year, a riot of roses, ribbons, and whispered rivalries. And with it came a most curious spectacle. The Earl of Evermere, the city's most unattainable bachelor, pursuing Miss Clara Hensley, the very woman he once dismissed. It began subtly, with gestures that made tongues wag and fans flutter. Each morning a fresh bouquet of lilies and ivory roses arrived at Waverley House, always accompanied by a small note written in his bold, slanted hand. "Forgive me nothing yet, but allow me to try." At first, Clara ignored them. She told herself his remorse was simply wounded pride, a fleeting fascination born of novelty. Yet each time she saw his crest embossed in gold upon the envelope, her heart betrayed her. One flutter, then another. She would open the letters late at night when the house was silent, reading his words by candlelight. They were never grand declarations, never desperate pleas, only quiet, consistent truths. "I was raised to admire beauty and command respect," one note read, "but you have taught me that grace and strength command far more." She folded that letter carefully and hid it between the pages of a book she never finished reading. When they met at society gatherings, their exchanges grew cautious but charged, like the slow burn of fire beneath silk. Nathaniel had changed, or at least he was learning to. He no longer approached her with the arrogance of a man who expected forgiveness. He approached her like a student hoping to earn it. At Lady Pembroke's luncheon, Clara found herself seated across from him. The conversation drifted easily: literature, music, and the absurdity of the Ton's obsession with perfection. When he quoted one of her favorite poets, she arched an eyebrow. "You've been reading," she observed. He smiled faintly. "Only what I hope might help me understand the woman I once misjudged." "And what have you learned?" she asked lightly, though her pulse quickened. "That plainness," he said, eyes steady on hers, "is not a lack of beauty, but a failure of others to look properly." Her lips parted, not in surprise, but in something closer to disbelief. "Careful, my lord, that almost sounds sincere." "It is," he said softly, "every word." Before she could respond, the room erupted in laughter at another table, and the spell broke. Yet, as the luncheon ended, he caught her gaze once more, and for the first time she didn't look away. By midsummer, London was divided into 2 camps, those who mocked the Earl's sudden devotion and those who romanticized it. "It's all a performance," some claimed. He's only chasing what he cannot have. Others whispered, he's in love, truly, foolishly, and far too late. Clara ignored the talk. She had no interest in being someone's scandal, even one cloaked in flowers and flattery. And yet his constancy began to wear at her resolve. She saw it in the small things, how he bowed slightly lower when greeting her mother, how he praised her godmother's charitable work, how he lingered near the music room only to listen to her play. He never imposed, never demanded. He waited. And waiting, she realized, was something only love or guilt could teach a man. One evening, at the Viscount of Stanhope's garden party, the air hummed with the scent of lilac and the murmur of violins. The twilight made everything softer, even pride. Clara walked among the rose-covered arches, her gown a soft shade of peach, her hair catching the dying light. Nathaniel found her there, alone by the fountain, where the water reflected the stars just beginning to appear. "Miss Hensley," he said gently, "have I earned a smile from you yet?" She turned, her expression unreadable. "You've earned persistence, my lord. I'll give you that." He chuckled. "Persistence suits me better than arrogance, I hope." "It's an improvement," she said, her tone teasing but kind. There was silence for a moment, a silence that felt fragile and expectant. The evening breeze stirred the roses, scattering petals at their feet. "I wish I could undo that night," he said at last. "Not because of how it made you see me, but because of how it made me see myself." Clara looked away, her throat tightening. "You cannot change what was said." "No," he admitted. "But perhaps I can make new words worth remembering." Her heart ached at his sincerity. She wanted to stay angry, to keep the safety of her pride. But in that golden half-light, as he stood there with every trace of vanity stripped away, she saw not the man who had once mocked her, but the one who had learned how to love without pretense. She stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. "And if I forgive you, my lord, what then?" "Then," he said, his voice trembling, "I would spend every day earning it again." For the first time she smiled, not coyly, not cruelly, but truly. "Then you may begin," she said softly, and turned to walk back toward the music. He didn't follow, not yet. He only watched her, that serene strength in her every movement, and thought that the world had never looked more beautiful than when she smiled because of him, not in spite of him. That night, as Clara sat by her window, she thought of all that had passed between them, the insult, the transformation, the chase. She realized that he no longer saw her as a conquest, nor she him as an enemy. What stood between them now was not revenge, but choice. Could she trust a man who had once broken her dignity? Could she risk her heart again, not for vanity, but for love? Below her window, faint but certain, she heard the clip of hooves. She looked out, and there he was, on horseback, glancing up toward her balcony. He didn't speak, didn't wave, only looked, as though to ask silently, "May I still try?" She smiled faintly and blew out her candle. Tomorrow, she decided, he would have his answer. The London air turned thick with summer and scandal, as it always did when hearts began to matter more than manners. By July, Miss Clara Hensley had become the season's most talked-about woman. Invitations poured in, painters begged to capture her likeness, poets wrote verses comparing her to Dawn. But admiration in London was a fickle thing. It adored what it could not destroy, and destroyed what it could no longer ignore. The whispers began, as all cruel things do, in corners. "She wasn't always so charming," murmured Lady Pembroke at tea. I remember her before her miraculous transformation. Shy, dull, practically invisible. Another voice chimed in. It's said she used her godmother's influence, the Marchioness of Waverley, to buy her way into favour. Some even say she studied flirtation as if it were an art. And then came the venom, and the Earl of Evermere. Well, we all know why a man reforms so suddenly. She must have promised him something worth the effort. The laughter that followed was soft, vicious, and unforgivable. That evening, at the Countess of Wexley's dinner party, the whispers reached Clara's ears at last. She sat between two gentlemen who spoke kindly, but pitied her too much, their smiles tight, their eyes darting. Across the table she saw Nathaniel, his gaze protective, searching, almost pleading for her to stay composed. But composure that evening felt like glass in her hands, fragile and sharp. When the Countess raised a toast to sincerity and humble virtue, the room erupted in polite laughter. The words were harmless on the surface, but Clara heard the poison beneath them. Someone chuckled, someone whispered her name. She rose from her chair, her pulse steady though her throat ached. "If sincerity is the subject, my lady," she said, her voice calm and clear, "then I must thank you for hosting an evening so rich in pretense." A stunned silence fell. The Countess blinked, colour draining from her cheeks. But before anyone could respond, Nathaniel stood. "Indeed," he said, his voice firm but unshaken. "Society does have a curious talent for mistaking cruelty for elegance. How fortunate that Miss Hensley never learned such a lesson." Every eye in the room turned toward him. He stepped forward, his words deliberate. "Many of you may remember the Earl of Evermere. Proud, vain, and blind to anything but his own reflection. I remember him too, and I am ashamed of the man he was, because that man called this woman plain." A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but his voice did not falter. He did not see that her worth had nothing to do with her face, that her beauty lay in her strength, her mind, her grace under cruelty. It took losing her to understand that truth. And if London cannot see it now, then perhaps London deserves its blindness. Clara's breath caught, her vision blurred, not from humiliation, but from the weight of his courage. The same man who had once mocked her now stood before all of London and confessed his shame. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Lady Pembroke coughed lightly, trying to recover her composure. "My dear Earl," she said with brittle laughter, "how noble of you to romanticize." "Romanticize?" he cut in. "No, to atone." His gaze swept the room. "I once believed charm could command admiration. Miss Hensley has shown me that integrity commands respect, and I will not see her dignity questioned by those who have never possessed any of their own." The Countess's fans stilled. No one dared speak again. When the dinner ended, the guests filed out in uneasy silence. Gossip had turned to awe, not because society had grown kinder, but because courage, even in scandal, was impossible to ignore. Clara stepped out into the cool night, the moonlight silvering the marble steps. Nathaniel followed her, his voice low and hesitant. "Forgive me. I should have stopped them sooner." She turned to him, eyes bright with unshed tears. "You didn't have to defend me, my lord." "Yes," he said, his voice trembling. "I did. I will, always." She studied him, her expression unreadable. "They will never forget what you said tonight." "Good," he said quietly. "Let them remember it every time they speak your name." Her lips parted, her breath catching in the quiet. "You've ruined your reputation for me." He smiled faintly. "Then it's finally worth something." For the first time since her exile from obscurity, Clara felt truly seen, not for her elegance or her wit, but for the woman she had always been beneath the expectations. The transformation everyone gossiped about was not her victory. This was standing beside a man who had learned to love her for her mind, her fire, her truth. When the carriage arrived, she hesitated at the door. "Good night, my lord," she said softly. Nathaniel bowed, his expression full of something between reverence and longing. "Good night, Miss Hensley." She stepped inside, but as the carriage pulled away, she looked back through the window and found him still standing there, hat in hand, watching until the night swallowed her completely. The next morning, the papers buzzed. "The Earl of Evermere defends Miss Hensley against slander. A love redeemed?" The headline spread faster than any rumour before it. Some laughed, some sneered, but most, in secret, admired them both. For the first time, London spoke not of beauty or scandal, but of devotion. At Waverley House, the Marchioness folded the paper with a satisfied sigh. "I told you," she said to Clara, sipping her tea, "if a man is worth keeping, he'll fight for your honour, not your approval." Clara smiled faintly. "Then perhaps, my lady, I've finally met a man worth keeping." That afternoon, as she walked through Hyde Park, a sudden shower began. She sought shelter under a willow tree, and found Nathaniel there, waiting, his coat damp, his expression tender. "I wondered if you'd come," he said softly. "I wondered if you'd wait," she replied. He smiled. "I would have waited forever." The rain thickened, soft and silver, blurring the city beyond. For a long moment they stood in silence, the world around them fading until only the sound of rain and the warmth between them remained. "Clara," he whispered, his voice raw, "you are the only thing I've ever wanted to be worthy of." Her breath trembled. "And if I say you already are?" He reached for her hand. "Then I will never. Stop proving it." And as the rain fell over London, washing away the remnants of gossip and pride, the Earl who once mocked love knelt before it, not in shame, but in devotion. Autumn came to London wrapped in gold, the leaves along Grosvenor Square turning from emerald to amber, the air scented with wood smoke and rain. The season had ended, and with it the fever of gossip that had once burned around them. Yet for Miss Clara Hensley and Lord Nathaniel Ashford, something far greater had taken its place, a quiet, steady peace that needed no audience. Weeks had passed since the scandal at the Countess's dinner, but its echo lingered in every corridor of society. Everywhere Clara went, people now bowed with newfound respect. She had not demanded admiration, she had simply earned it, but for all the flowers, invitations and praise, it was one face she still sought in every crowd, the man who had stood before all of London and called himself her fool. And tonight that man would stand before her again. The Queen's autumn gala marked the close of the social year, an evening of splendour reserved for the few who had managed to survive the season unscathed. Clara had been invited not merely as a guest, but as an honoured figure. Her reputation, once fragile, now glimmered like a diamond that had been cut by fire. As her maid fastened the final pearl in her hair, the Marchioness of Waverley entered the room, her expression both proud and amused. "Well," she said, surveying her goddaughter, "you've made a liar out of London." Clara smiled softly. "I never meant to." "Perhaps not," the Marchioness said, adjusting the lace at her sleeve. "But greatness rarely asks permission. Remember, my dear, forgiveness is not weakness. It's the final form of power." When Clara arrived at the palace, the ballroom blazed with candlelight. Music drifted from the orchestra, soft and lilting, and the marble floor shimmered beneath the glow. She moved through the crowd with the grace of someone who no longer needed to prove her worth. Yet her pulse quickened as she reached the grand staircase, because at the base of it, waiting as if the world had held its breath for this very moment, stood Nathaniel. He was dressed in black and white, simple and elegant, his eyes steady but uncertain. When he saw her, his expression softened into something that looked like both wonder and relief. He bowed deeply, his voice low. "Miss Hensley?" "My lord," she replied, her tone calm but trembling at the edges. "I feared you would not come tonight," he said quietly. "I almost didn't," she admitted. "But then I remembered I'm no longer the girl who runs from your words." His gaze deepened. "No, you're the woman who made me change mine." The orchestra began a slow waltz and he extended his hand. "One last dance before London retires for the winter?" Clara hesitated, then smiled. "Very well, my lord, but only one." When he took her hand, it was not with the practiced ease of a man used to possession, but with the reverence of one who knew what it meant to lose. They stepped onto the dance floor as the music swelled, graceful, deliberate, almost painfully tender. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward them, but neither seemed to notice. "You've rebuilt me, Clara," he said softly as they moved, "piece by piece until I no longer recognized the man I was." She shook her head. "You rebuilt yourself, Nathaniel. I simply stood where you could see what needed changing." He smiled faintly. "And will you believe me now, when I say I love you?" Her breath caught. "Love was never your problem, my lord. Believing in it was." The waltz slowed, and for a moment it seemed the world held still. He stopped moving, still holding her hand, eyes glimmering with unshed emotion. "Then let me show you what I believe," he whispered. And in full view of every duchess, count, and gossip in the hall, the Earl of Evermere knelt, not in spectacle, but in sincerity. Gasps rippled through the room, fans fluttered, whispers spread like wind through silk. But Clara saw none of it. She saw only him, the man who had once broken her with pride and now rebuilt her with devotion. "Clara Hensley," he said, voice steady though his hands trembled slightly, "I once thought you beneath me. Then I learned I could not rise without you. You taught me that beauty is not what the world sees, but what the soul learns to recognize. If you can still find it in your heart to love me, not the Earl, not the title, but the man who stands before you now, I would be honored to call you my wife." The ballroom held its breath. Clara's throat tightened, tears threatening to spill. She had dreamt of this once, not the proposal, but the vindication. The moment when the man who had shamed her would kneel instead. But standing here now, she realized this was not victory. It was forgiveness. She reached down, took his hand and whispered, "Rise, Nathaniel. You needn't kneel to love me. Just walk beside me." He stood slowly, eyes shimmering. "Then walk with me, forever." A tear escaped down her cheek as she smiled. "Forever, then." And when he kissed her, gently, reverently, as though sealing a vow, the orchestra swelled and the room erupted in applause. Not mockery this time, but admiration. The story that began in cruelty ended in grace. Later that night, as the stars glowed over London and the carriages rolled away, they stood together on the palace terrace, the city stretching beneath them. "Do you remember the first thing you ever said about me?" she asked, half smiling. He winced. "I remember every word. I wish I could take back." "Good," she said softly. "Then you'll never forget how far we've come." He looked at her, pride and love mingling in his gaze. You were never plain, Clara. You were a mirror. You showed me who I truly was and who I wanted to be. She leaned into him, her voice no louder than a whisper. Then I suppose we've both changed. And as the first snow of the season began to fall, soft, silent, forgiving, the Earl and the woman he once overlooked stood beneath it, no longer bound by vanity or vengeance, but by a love that had seen them both at their worst and chosen them still. Because in a city that worshipped appearances, they had found something rarer than beauty: truth.